Redwater Bend, Colorado Territory, autumn 1884. The morning a dying widow's sickbed got dragged into the street, and the morning that would change everything for the richest man in the territory, because a stranger on a dark bay horse had already stopped to watch. Should have paid on time, Silas Corrigan said it to no one in particular. The way a man states a fact, he finds entirely satisfying. He stood on the boardwalk across the street in a coat too fine for a town this small, watching two men wrestle an iron bed frame through a doorway into the morning light. The woman on the porch steps had a shawl pulled tight against a chill that wasn't really there, and a cough that folded her forward every few seconds, like something was trying to close her up from the inside. "Leave the mattress," Corrigan added, almost as an afterthought. "She can sleep on it in the road." At the end of the block, a horse had stopped. Its rider hadn't dismounted. He hadn't moved at all beyond the slow, deliberate turn of his head toward the porch, and then toward the man giving the orders. "Put it back." 4 words, flat and unhurried. The kind of sentence a man says once and expects to be the last word on the matter. Silas Corrigan turned toward the voice with the patient, faintly amused irritation of a man who has owned this town long enough to know that nobody tells him to put anything back, not twice, and as far as he could remember, not even. What happened across the next 20 minutes on that street would end, in the space of a single motion, the career of the fastest gun 3 counties had ever produced, and it would leave Silas Corrigan understanding something about the true price of an audience that he would carry. But to understand any of that, to understand why a woman was on her porch steps with her furniture in the street, and why a nameless man on a tired bay horse had decided that this particular Wednesday morning, to the seasoned Silas Corrigan first rode into Redwater Bend with a satchel of freight money and a very patient kind of hunger. Before we go further, a quick word. If these frontier stories are the kind you replay at midnight, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and never miss the next ride. Redwater Bend in 1878 had been an unremarkable crossroads town, the kind of place a stagecoach stopped at only because the horses needed watering and the next real town was 11 hours farther on. It had a dry goods store, a livery, a boarding house that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage, and a scattering of homesteads pushed up against the foothills where the grass still grew tall enough to hide a rider's boots. Silas Corrigan arrived that spring with money he claimed came from a freight contract out of Kansas, though nobody who later did business with him ever quite believed the arithmetic added up to what he was spending. He bought the dry goods store first, for cash, from an owner who was tired and in debt and glad to be rid of it. Then he waited. That was the thing about Corrigan that made him almost impossible to resist, and it was the thing that took the town years to understand about him. He was never in a hurry. He did not swindle anyone in a single dramatic afternoon. He bought the saloon 2 years later, when its owner's wife took sick, and the medical bills piled higher than the receipts. He bought the livery the year after that, when a bad winter left the stable owner unable to make good on a loan Corrigan himself had quietly arranged to be called due at the worst possible moment. He acquired the water rights on Widow Creek from an actual widow, a woman named Constance Farrow, who had inherited the tributary from her husband and had not fully understood signing the paper Corrigan's lawyer set in front of her precisely what she was giving away. By the autumn this story takes place, Silas Corrigan owned or held crushing debt against 34 of the 46 buildings standing in Redwater Bend and the valley around it. The 12 he did not own belonged either to people with enough cash saved to refuse his terms outright, or to people who simply hadn't yet been handed the specific combination of bad luck that made selling look like the only sensible choice. Take the saloon, for instance, because the saloon tells you almost everything you need to know about how Silas Corrigan preferred to work. Its owner, a barrel-chested former teamster named Otis Pruitt, had built the place himself with his own hands the year before Corrigan ever set foot in Redwater Bend, and he'd built it well, and it turned a modest, honest profit for 3 straight years. Then Pruitt's wife fell sick with a wasting fever that no doctor in 3 counties could put a name to, and the medicine and the specialist wired in from Denver, and the weeks Pruitt spent away from his own bartending her cost more than the saloon could earn in a season. Corrigan came to him not as a rival, but as a friend, or so he framed it, offering a loan against the building at terms that seemed, in the moment a man is watching his wife struggle to breathe, almost generous. Pruitt's wife recovered. Eventually, the loan did not. Within 18 months, the interest alone had outpaced anything the saloon could produce, and Corrigan owned the building outright and kept Pruitt on as its manager at a wage 1/3 of what he'd once earned as its owner, and never once, in all the years after, mentioned the arrangement as anything other than a kindness he'd extended to a friend in a hard season. The livery went the same slow way 2 years after that. Its owner, a quiet Norwegian farrier named Halvard Nystrom, took out what should have been a small, sensible loan to replace a barn roof that a hailstorm had torn to splinters, and Corrigan, who by then controlled the only bank willing to lend money in Redwater Bend, through channels Nystrom never fully understood and certainly never saw laid out on paper in front of him, for the note to come due 11 months earlier than the terms Nystrom believed he'd signed. And the water rights on Widow Creek came from Constance Farrow, a woman genuinely widowed by a rockslide that had taken her husband 2 winters before Corrigan ever arrived, who had inherited the tributary and the modest income it produced, and who sat across a desk from Corrigan's lawyer one autumn afternoon that she did not fully grasp until the following spring, when her own water bill arrived for the first time in her life, exactly what she had traded away. None of it, taken piece by piece, looked much like theft. That was the whole architecture of how Silas Corrigan built what he built alone here, extended in a moment of genuine crisis. A note called due there, on terms technically within his rights. A signature obtained from a grieving woman who trusted the pleasant, unhurried man across the desk from her, because nothing in his manner gave her any reason not to. 6 years of that, applied with total patience across every soft place a town like Redwater Bend had to offer, had built Silas Corrigan an empire that no single law in the territory could touch, because no single piece of it had technically broken any law at all. Corrigan himself was 52 years old that autumn, a compact, tidy man with a round face that had once, people said, been genuinely pleasant, before years of patient advantage-taking sanded the warmth out of it and left behind something that only resembled kindness the way a dress storefront resembles a building with anything worth buying inside it. He dressed well, spoke in slow, measured sentences, and smiled easily and without warmth, the way some men learn to smile, when they've discovered it costs them nothing. He preferred patience to force as an instrument because patience left no bruises anyone could point to in a courtroom. But he had shown, more than once, that force was available the moment patience became inconvenient. His instrument for those occasions had a name, Cyrus Lund was 33 years old and carried the title of property manager, which in Redwater Bend meant something considerably heavier than the word suggested. He was long-limbed and angular, with a weathered face and a jaw set in a particular flat expression, blank, patient, faintly contemptuous, that had, over years of practice, come to produce the desired result in most rooms. He wore a Colt single-action army on his right hip in a holster kept oiled and supple, and he had drawn it in earnest 3 times in the 6 years since Corrigan brought him north from a mining camp in New Mexico. Each of those 3 times had been ruled self-defense by the town's justice of the peace, a mild, agreeable man who held court in a building Corrigan owned and drew a salary from a municipal fund Corrigan's tax payments largely sustained. The most recent of those 3 rulings had come only the previous summer against a homesteader named Ezra Coombs, who had ridden into town after Corrigan's men pulled up his fence line and run cattle across ground Coombs believed correctly as it turned out. Coombs had come armed and shouting, which was a mistake because shouting told Lund exactly where a man's hand was going to go before the man himself had fully decided. Lund had not raised his voice once through the whole encounter. He had simply waited, hand loose at his side, until Coombs' own temper did the work for him, and when Coombs finally reached, Lund's shot took him in the shoulder before Coombs's revolver had cleared leather more than an inch. The justice of the peace ruled its self-defense inside of an afternoon. Coombs kept his arm, lost the use of 2 fingers on it permanently, and left the territory before the leaves turned that year. Nobody in Redwater Bend ever again rode toward Cyrus Lund shouting about anything. Lund was not, by the standard the dime novels like to use, a fast man. He was something more dangerous than fast. Every morning behind the livery before the town was properly awake, he ran the same drill, draw level imagined trigger brake holster, again until the motion had been sanded down to almost nothing, until there was no wasted inch of travel left anywhere in it, just the shortest possible arc from hip to sight line that physics would allow. He had never once in 6 years met a situation that arc proved insufficient for arc. Her name was Adeline Voss, and she had come to Redwater Bend 4 years earlier with her husband Micah and their 2 children, a boy named Caleb, 11 that autumn, and a girl named Josie. Micah Voss had been a careful, capable man, the kind who kept a ledger balanced to the penny and never once missed a payment in his life, and between the 2 of them, they had made the shop work well enough to keep the family fed, the rent paid. Then, 14 months after they arrived, in the hard grip of a winter that killed 3 other men in the valley besides him, Micah Voss died of a chest fever that came on fast and never let go. They had come west from Ohio on the strength of a letter from Micah's cousin, who'd written home describing a growing territory, hungry for a milliner's steady hand, and the family had arrived in Redwater Bend with a wagon, 2 trunks of good felt and ribbon stock, and enough savings to lease the storefront and stock the shelves and still sleep easy through the first winter. Micah had built the shop's counter and shelving himself evenings and Sundays, while Adeline sewed by lamplight, and within the first year, the Voss millinery had become the kind of small, dependable fixture a town builds its rhythm around the place where a rancher's wife came for a Sunday bonnet. Adeline remembered that first year, when people asked her about it later as the best of her life, better even than she'd understood at the time it was happening, which she supposed was simply the way of good years. The fever that took Micah moved through him in 11 days, starting as an ordinary chest cold and ending with a night so bad that Doc Hale, newly arrived in Redwater Bend himself that winter, sat up with the family until nearly dawn and could do in the end almost nothing. Adeline held her husband's hand through the worst of it, while Caleb, only 9 then, kept the children's room quiet and warm, the way his father had shown him. And Josie, barely 5, slept through the worst of that final night without ever fully grasping what she'd lost until she was old enough to ask why other children had fathers who came home in the evening. That left Adeline with 2 children, a shop, a rental agreement on a storefront that belonged to Silas Corrigan, and a set of lungs that had been fragile since a childhood bout of pleurisy, and that the dry, dust-scoured climate of the territory was slowly and steadily making worse. She kept the shop running for the better part of 2 years after Micah died, which was, in the plain arithmetic of what it required, an extraordinary thing that almost nobody in Redwater Bend fully appreciated, mostly because the alternative was unthinkable, and she had made the impossible look merely difficult. Caleb helped stock the shelves and run deliveries before and after school. Josie learned to trim ribbon and sweep the floor before she'd properly learned her letters. But children, however willing, cannot fully compensate for a mother whose breath grows shorter every season, and the shop's income thinned as her strength did. The rent did not thin with it. Corrigan had come to see her himself that past February, sitting in her shop with his hat balanced on his knee and his warm, warmthless expression fixed in place, and had explained the situation with the patient. Comprehensive thoroughness of a man who had delivered this particular speech to a great many people and had refined it down to its most efficient form. The arrears, some $63 by then, on a rent of $9 a month, the terms of the original lease, and the 2 available paths forward. A settlement in which she would sign over certain remaining assets, or a continuation of the current arrangement on the strict understanding that the arrears be cleared within 45 days. Adeline had asked for 90. She had been given 45, and she had spent every one of them attempting to do a thing that could not actually be done, wring a season's worth of income out of a millinery shop run by a woman whose lungs failed her a little more with every cold morning. She remembered that February conversation in more detail than she remembered almost anything else from that whole hard year, because it was the moment she first understood all the way down exactly what kind of arithmetic she was up against. Corrigan had sat in the one good chair in her front room, hat on his knee, and had spoken to her the entire time in the calm, reasonable tone of a man discussing weather, rather than a woman's home. "You understand, I take no pleasure in this," he told her, and she remembered thinking, even through the fog of that morning's coughing fit, that he seemed to genuinely believe it. He'd suggested gently that a woman in her condition might find it easier, in the long run, to let the shop go now on favorable terms rather than watch it slip away from her piece by piece over a harder year still to come. Adeline had thanked him for his concern and told him she intended to keep her shop, her children's home, and her own 2 feet under her for as long as either of those 2 things could be arranged, and Corrigan had smiled his warm, warmthless smile, replaced his hat, and told her that 45 days was, all things considered, a generous accommodation. She did not tell Caleb or Josie how close the walls had drawn in by that spring. She sewed later into the evenings than her lungs really allowed, took in mending from 3 of the ranch wives who still had coin to spare, and twice sold pieces of her own good jewelry, quietly, to a trader passing through, rather than let either child see how frightened she'd become. Doc Hale, who checked on her every few weeks whether she asked him to or not, told her plainly in April that her lungs could not sustain the pace she was keeping, and Adeline had told him just as plainly that her lungs would simply have to manage it because nobody else was going to keep a roof over Caleb and Josie's heads if she stopped. On the morning it finally came due, which was a Wednesday, Cyrus Lund arrived with 2 hired men and a legal notice drawn up by a lawyer whose office sat in a building Corrigan owned. Caleb and Josie were at the schoolhouse 3 streets over, unaware that anything at all was happening to their home that morning. Adeline answered the door in her shawl, because even a mild autumn morning set her lungs to aching, and she read the notice standing in her own doorway and asked, quietly, for 1 more week. She was told that 1 more week was not among the available options. 3 streets over, inside the 1-room schoolhouse, Caleb sat through his arithmetic lesson with no idea that 2 of Corrigan's hired men were at that very moment lifting his mother's bed frame off its legs. Josie, in the row ahead of him, was practicing her letters on a slate, and neither child would learn what had happened that morning until the walk home at noon, when they would round the corner onto the main street and see their own furniture standing out in the open dirt in front of a crowd of neighbors who had gathered. That crowd had already begun forming by the time Adeline stood reading the notice in her own doorway. Otis Pruitt stepped out from behind his bar to stand in the saloon's open door drying a glass he had already dried twice. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett Boone, who owed Corrigan money on his own forge and knew better than to say anything out loud, stood in his shop entrance with his arms folded and his jaws set. The young circuit preacher, in town for only a few days that month, stood on the church steps 2 doors down with his hands clasped in front of him, praying or simply watching. Nobody could later say for certain which. None of them moved to help. That was the arrangement Silas Corrigan had spent 6 years building without ever once having to say it plainly. Everyone in Redwater Bend understood exactly what happened to a man who crossed him, and understanding that was enough on any ordinary morning. Corrigan came to watch. He did this for evictions he considered instructive, which, if he was honest with himself, was most of them. There was a private satisfaction in it, certainly, but the satisfaction was not really the point. The point was the signal it sent to the people he knew were watching from behind their curtains and shop-front glass all up and down that street, that the machinery of consequence in Redwater Bend was observed, endorsed, and operated from the very top. He stood on the boardwalk across the street, hands folded behind his back, watching Lund's 2 hired men carry Adeline's iron bed frame out through the doorway and set it down in the dirt when a rider came into view at the north end of the street, moving at an easy, unhurried walk. Opal Hutchins, who kept the dry goods counter in what had once been her own family store and was now on terms she tried very hard not to think about too closely, Corrigan's store. She noticed the horse first because she had grown up around horses and knew exactly what she was looking at. A dark bay gelding, dusty and travel-worn on the outside, but moving with the collected, unbothered discipline of an animal that had been trained by someone who understood that a horse's composure, not luck. It would not spook at a gunshot fired 6 feet from its ear. Opal had spent enough years around frontier stock to know that those 2 facts together, the dust and the discipline, said something specific and worth paying attention to about the man in the saddle. A canvas duster, road gray with trail dust, hat with a cracked, sun-faded brim pulled low, a plain dark holster tied down at the thigh with a strip of rawhide gone soft and frayed from years of use. Large, weathered hands resting easy on the saddle horn, the backs of them marked with the faint, particular scarring that came from black powder handled close, over and over for a long time. The whole posture of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of one, and had made an old peace with that fact. Opal stepped back from her own front window without entirely meaning to. She would try to explain it afterward, for years afterward, and the closest she ever came was to say that something in the sheer stillness of the man as he reined up at the end of the street had reached some old animal part of her brain and told it that a variable had just entered the situation that none of the calculations already underway on that street had accounted for. The stranger looked first at Adeline Voss on her porch steps, the shawl, the cough, the face of a woman who has been fighting something for so long she stopped expecting to win it, and has settled instead into simply managing the terms of the losing. He looked at the two hired men holding her bed frame. He looked at Lund, standing off to the side with his arms folded, supervising, and then he looked across the street at Silas Corrigan. "Put it back." Corrigan turned toward the voice, wearing the expression powerful men in small towns learn to produce for exactly this kind of moment, mild amusement at a situation that is about to become instructive for whoever started it. He studied the dusty duster, the cracked hat, the worn rig at the man's hip, and he ran the same calculation he had run 100 times before about the cost of various responses. He tipped his head a fraction of an inch toward Cyrus Lund. Adeline, still on her steps, felt the whole street go still around her in a way she would try, unsuccessfully, to describe for years afterward. It wasn't silence exactly. A dog barked somewhere behind the livery, a loose shutter knocked twice against a windowsill down the block, but something underneath the ordinary sounds had gone taut, the way air goes taut before a summer storm breaks. She looked at the stranger at the end of the street, and felt, for reasons she couldn't have explained to Doc Hale or to anyone else, less afraid in that moment than she had felt at any point since Corrigan's men first knocked on her door that morning. It made no sense to her watching a second gunman ride into the middle of her ruin. She would only understand it clearly much later, when she had time to sit with the memory. Some old unschooled part of her had already read the situation, the same way Opal Hutchins had read it from behind her window glass, and had already decided correctly which of the two men standing in that street was the dangerous one, and which merely wanted to be. Lund uncrossed his arms. He walked to the center of the street and stopped 20 paces from the rider, his right hand hanging loose but close to the grip of his Colt, the specific unforced readiness of a hand that had long since stopped needing to be told where it belonged. He looked the stranger over with the same blank, faintly contemptuous patience he had built a 6-year career out of. "Friend," Lund said in the voice of a man used to having the last word in any room he stood in, "you've made a mistake." The stranger looked at him. It was. Everyone who watched from behind a window that morning would later try to describe the particular quality of that look, and none of them would ever quite manage it. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't a challenge. It was the look of a man completing a fast, thorough inventory of something he had encountered before filing it accordingly and moving on. He held Lund's eyes for perhaps a single second, then looked past him, back to Corrigan. "The woman's furniture," the stranger said. 3 words the second time he had spoken since riding into town. Same flat, matter-of-fact tone, a man describing an unfinished chore and identifying, without heat, exactly whose job it was to finish it. Corrigan's pleasant expression tightened. He stepped off the boardwalk into the street itself, which was not a thing he did. His authority had always operated from behind a desk, a ledger, a lawyer's careful language, never from the open dirt of the street with the whole town's eyes on him. But the man at the end of the block had spoken past Lund entirely, as though Lund were nothing more than a minor circumstance, rather than the fastest gun in 3 counties, and the audience behind the window glass. "Cyrus," Corrigan said, "there is a version of this story where the stranger loses." Nobody in Redwater Bend that morning, watching from behind curtains and cracked shop doors, would have bet against it. Cyrus Lund had never lost, not once, not to anyone, in 6 years of trying. This is not that version. Stick with it to the end, because before we get to why, become a channel member. The join button sits right there beside the channel name. Lund drew. It was, by any honest measure, exactly what 6 years of relentless practice had made it. The Colt cleared its holster. In the single most efficient arc, 10,000 mornings behind the livery had calibrated into muscle and bone. No wasted travel, no hesitation anywhere in the motion. The barrel rising toward the rider at the end of the street, while Lund's eye found the sights and his finger found the trigger, and the hammer began its short, practiced fall. The stranger's draw was not a faster version of the same thing. It belonged to a different category of event entirely. Not the way one runner outpaces another runner, but the way a dropped stone outpaces a man's hand reaching to catch it. His worn Colt came clear of that frayed rawhide tie-down in a motion that had stripped away every ounce of anything not strictly necessary, no rise to eye level, no travel beyond the bare minimum geometry. And the round left his barrel before Lund's hammer had finished its fall, before Lund's own barrel had fully found its line, before Lund's eye had even completed the sight picture it had been hunting for. The bullet caught Lund's Colt square at the cylinder frame. At 20 paces, a .45 caliber round, fired with that kind of cold, unbothered geometry, tore the weapon's mechanism apart and ripped it clean out of Lund's hand, sending it spinning into the dirt 3 feet to his left. His hand was untouched. His arm was untouched. And, for the first time in 6 years of standing in that particular stance in that particular street, Cyrus Lund's face wore an expression that had, up to that morning, simply never had cause to exist on it. He stood there, looking down at his own empty hand as though it belonged to somebody else. The stranger's Colt was already back in its holster. The whole exchange, start to finish, had taken less time than it takes to say the sentence describing it. Up and down the street, behind glass and curtain and half-open doorway, Redwater Bend exhaled all at once a sound nobody individually made but that seemed to rise collectively out of the whole block regardless. Opal Hutchins realized her own hands were pressed flat against her front window glass, the same way Doc Hale's would be pressed against his not, 30 seconds later, and she did not remember putting them there. Somewhere behind the livery a horse whinnied sharp and startled, as though the animal itself had felt the change in the air before any human on that street had finished processing it. Garrett Boone, the blacksmith, let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since Corrigan first said Lund's name, and did not move from his own doorway, but something in his shoulders came down half an inch that had been set hard against his spine for 6 straight years. The pause that followed the shot was by every account gathered afterward, longer than the shot itself. Nobody moved. Even Corrigan, a man who had spent 6 years never once looking uncertain in public, stood with his mouth very slightly open, the calculation running visibly behind his eyes and finding for the first time anyone in Redwater Bend had ever witnessed no answer at all. Silas Corrigan stood in the middle of his own street with the specific, sinking expression of a man who has just watched the load-bearing wall of his entire understanding of the world get kicked out from beneath him and has not yet fallen. He looked at Lund's empty hand. He looked at the colt lying in the dirt. He looked at the rider at the end of the street, who had not moved from his saddle and whose expression was exactly what it had been the moment he first reined up, the flat-settled patience of a man waiting for an ordinary, overdue thing to finish happening. The 2 hired men who had carried Adeline's bed frame out into the road looked at each other. They looked at Lund. They looked at the man on the bay horse. Then, without a word passing between them, they bent down, picked the bed frame back up, and carried it back inside the house. The stranger watched the doorway until it stood empty of furniture entirely. Then he looked back across the street, past Lund, past the 2 hired men, straight at Corrigan. The rest, 2 words. The 4th and final time he spoke that morning in Redwater Bend. Corrigan stood in the street for a long moment calculating, because calculating was the only thing he had ever really known how to do. But the calculation that had reliably solved every problem for 6 straight years, the one in which Cyrus Lund was the dependable variable that closed out any unresolved situation, had just been proven false in front of the entire town, and the new sum he was trying to work out kept refusing to add up to anything he could live with. He looked at the doorway where his 2 hired men now stood waiting empty-handed. He looked at Lund, still staring down at the hand that had for the whole of his adult life never once failed him. He looked at the windows and doorways up and down the street where the town he had spent 6 patient years assembling was watching him with the specific, held stillness of people who had been waiting, without knowing it. He walked out into the street to where Adeline Voss's furniture sat scattered in the dirt. He bent down. He picked up a chair. He carried it, himself, back through her doorway, a plain ladder-back chair. Nothing fine, its cane seat worn thin from years of use, and the whole street watched Silas Corrigan hold it against his own fine coat and carry it up 2 porch steps like any hired hand might. He came back out for the next piece, and the next. The 2 hired men fell in beside him and helped carry the rest, because the stranger at the end of the street was still sitting his horse with the flat, unbothered patience of a man who had nowhere else in the world he needed to be and was entirely prepared to wait as long as it took for the correct and obvious thing to finish getting done. It took the better part of 20 minutes to return every last piece of Adeline Voss's household to precisely the position it had occupied before that morning began. Adeline herself sat on her porch steps through all of it, shawl pulled tight, breath rattling faintly in her chest, wearing the expression of a woman who has spent so long managing the terms of a slow loss that she does not yet possess the language to process the fact that the terms have, without warning, changed underneath her. When the last piece, her own sickbed, the one Corrigan had ordered stripped down to the frame not half an hour earlier, was carried back through the door and set right where it had always stood. The stranger looked at Adeline once. A single level look, carrying no warmth in it and no performance either. Nothing but the plain acknowledgment that the thing needing doing had been done. Then he turned his bay horse north and rode out of Redwater Bend at the same unhurried walk he had ridden in on. Doc Reuben Hale, who had watched the entire 20 minutes from his surgery window with both palms pressed flat against the glass, was the first person on that street to step outside once the stranger had gone. He crossed to where Adeline sat on her steps, lowered himself down beside her, and listened to her breathing with the quiet, patient attention of a man who has learned that some mornings don't call for words yet. He didn't say anything for a long while. There wasn't anything that needed saying just yet. Caleb and Josie came around the corner at noon, same as any ordinary school day, and found the street full of neighbors instead of empty the way it usually was, and their own front room's curtains hanging crooked in the window where someone's hurried hands had rehung them. Caleb broke into a run before he'd fully understood what he was running toward. Josie ran after him. By the time they reached their own steps, Adeline was already standing again, unsteady but upright, one hand braced on the doorframe, and she gathered both children in against her before either one could ask what had happened. Caleb would ask her that night and for years afterward who the man on the horse had been. Adeline never had an answer that satisfied him, mostly because she never had an answer at all. Silas Corrigan walked back to his office, in a building that had once belonged to somebody else entirely, and sat behind his desk for a very long time. Adeline Voss's rental agreement lay in front of him on the blotter. He looked at it without touching it for what Opal Hutchins later swore was the better part of an hour, watching him through the connecting wall of the dry goods store. Then he opened the desk drawer, put the paper inside it, and did not take it back out again for the rest of that year. He never spoke about that Wednesday morning to anyone in Redwater Bend, not once, for the rest of the time he lived there. His clerk, a nervous young man named Whit Sorrell, who kept his books, later said that Corrigan's handwriting in the ledgers changed after that autumn, grew smaller, tighter, as though the man writing it had become, in some private way, more careful about everything he committed to paper. Whether that carefulness came from fear of the stranger returning, or from some quieter reckoning, Corrigan never spoke aloud. Sorrell couldn't say, and Corrigan himself gave no one the satisfaction of an explanation. The debt itself was never forgiven. That's an important thing to sit with, because it would be easy, telling a story like this one, to round the ending off into something softer and tidier than what actually happened. The arrears were not wiped away. The terms of the lease were never rewritten. Silas Corrigan did not wake up the next morning a fundamentally different man than the one who had gone to sleep the night before. He remained, in every way that mattered, exactly the man 6 patient years had made him. But he did not attempt another eviction anywhere in Redwater Bend for the better part of a year, and when he finally did, it happened on a homestead at the far edge of the valley, with no crowd gathered to watch it, and Corrigan himself stayed behind his desk the whole time. He sent Cyrus Lund alone that time, without ceremony, without an audience, because whatever else could be said about Silas Corrigan, he was a man who understood a signal when one had been delivered to him personally, in the middle of his own street, in front of everyone whose respect he had spent 6 years buying. Cyrus Lund left Redwater Bend 5 weeks later. He never offered Corrigan an explanation for going. He collected his final wages, saddled his own horse, and rode north, the same direction, though nobody ever confirmed whether that was coincidence or something closer to a debt he felt he owed himself to settle. He had spent 6 years believing himself to be a very specific kind of man, a man of a very specific caliber and capability, and that belief had been quietly, permanently revised in the space of about 1 second on an ordinary street in Redwater Bend. Opal Hutchins told the story of what she'd watched from behind that dry goods window for the rest of her life, and she always started the same way, with the horse. She said you could read the whole coming morning off that bay gelding before its rider had done a single thing. Because what the horse told you, if you'd spent enough years around horses to listen, was that you were looking at a man who prepared methodically for things, and that whatever was about to happen that morning had already been counted among the things he'd prepared for. She said the horse was, in its own quiet way, the most frightening part of the entire morning, which people found puzzling until she explained her reasoning, and then, without exception, Doc Hale, for his part, always said what stayed with him was the 4 words at the very beginning, and the 2 words at the very end, and the near total silence stretched between them. In 30 years of practicing frontier medicine, he liked to say he had watched men do terrible things while using a great many words, and he had watched men do genuinely necessary things while using almost none, and the ratio between those 2 kinds of men was never what you'd expect walking into a room, but it was, in his long experience, remarkably consistent. The stranger had spoken exactly 9 words across the whole of that Wednesday morning, and had accomplished in under half an hour something that 6 years of petitions, formal complaints, and quietly furious letters to the Territorial Land Office had never once managed. Gun-complicated return of a dying woman's furniture to the inside of her own house. Doc Hale said he never learned the stranger's name. He said he never once felt the need to. The story traveled well past Redwater Bend, the way these stories always do, carried by drovers and freight haulers, and the occasional traveling preacher who'd heard it second-hand and told it third-hand in towns. By the following spring, versions of the tale were circulating as far as the rail depot Caleb would later drive freight to, most of them wrong in some detail or another. Some had the stranger drawing against 3 men instead of 1. One particularly popular version claimed he'd once ridden with the law down in Texas before something turned him solitary. Nobody in any of those towns could confirm a single one of the variations, because nobody in the end had anything more to go on than what Redwater Bend itself remembered. A dark bay horse, 4 words at the start, 2 at the finish. To fully put into words. If you've made it this far into Redwater Bend's story, you already understand why it's still told the way it is. If it's earned a spot in your regular rotation, become a channel member, tap join right beside the channel name, and stories like Adeline's keep finding their way to you first. Adeline Voss stayed on in Redwater Bend. She kept the millinery shop running for nearly 4 more years before her lungs finally made the daily work of it impossible. And when that day came, her daughter Josie, 11 by then, sharp with a needle and sharper with a customer, drove freight between Redwater Bend and the rail depot, 2 counties over, to keep the family fed. The shop was still open, its windows still dressed with ribbon, and felt every spring, the year Silas Corrigan finally sold off his Redwater Bend holdings and moved his operation to a growing rail town farther west. Adeline's rental agreement was among the papers transferred in that sale. The new owner, for reasons he never fully explained even to himself, cut the rent by nearly half within his first month of holding it. Nobody in Redwater Bend ever drew a straight line between that decision and a Wednesday morning 6 years earlier. Nobody ever went looking hard enough to find one. Redwater Bend itself changed in ways nobody could point to on a map or a ledger, but that everyone who lived through that autumn felt all the same. Garrett Boone, the blacksmith, found himself a little slower to hand over the full asking price the next time Corrigan's office sent a note about his forge debt, and discovered, to his own mild surprise, that pushing back cost him nothing at all. Otis Pruitt began quietly buying back small shares of his own saloon whenever he had a spare dollar, a process that took him the better part of 6 years, but that he pursued, he later admitted, with a patience he credited entirely to a Wednesday morning he'd watched from his own front door. It was not a revolution. Silas Corrigan kept most of what he owned for a long while yet, and the valley's hard economics did not rearrange themselves overnight because one gun hand had lost a fight in the street. But something in the town's collective posture straightened, in increments too small to measure and too real to deny, and people who had once simply absorbed whatever Corrigan's office sent them began, here and there. Adeline's decline, when it finally came, arrived slowly, the way Doc Hale had always warned her it would. She kept the shop through 4 more autumns, each one a little harder on her breath than the last, propping herself on a tall stool behind the counter in her final working year because standing for long stretches had become more than her lungs could manage. Josie grew up fast in the particular way children of a sick parent often do, capable and watchful well before her years, and by the time she formally took the shop over, she had already been quietly running most of it for a year or better. Caleb grew tall and steady, and freight work suited him, and he made sure every single month, without fail, that his mother and sister never once went without. The Nameless Gunman appears in no court record, no property deed, no formal letter of complaint, anywhere connected to Redwater Bend, Colorado territory. He survives only in the accounts of the people who happened to be watching that particular morning, in Opal Hutchins' telling, and in Doc Hale's, and, most vividly of all, in the account of an 11-year-old boy named Jesse Calloway, who had been walking home from the schoolhouse when the eviction began, and had watched the entire draw itself from a corner 2 doors down, the only witness in Redwater Bend, with a completely unobstructed line of sight to the whole thing. Jesse described it to his father that same evening as being like watching somebody think of something very quickly. His father asked him what on earth he meant by that. Jesse thought about it a while and said it was as though the thought and the action had happened as the exact same thing, with no space of any kind between them, and that was the closest he could come to putting words around it. His father hadn't seen the draw himself, but he told people what his son had said about it for the rest of his own life, because sometimes a child's plain description of something he has no grown-up language for turns out to be the truest account anybody ever manages to give. Jesse Calloway grew up to become, of all things, the county's own land recorder, a job that put him behind a desk very much like the one Silas Corrigan had once sat behind, filing deeds and settling boundary disputes for the better part of, he liked to say, late in his life, that he had spent his whole career trying to make sure no clerk's careless language and no lawyer's fine print ever again let one man quietly gather up an entire valley the way Corrigan had gathered up Redwater Bend. Exacting man, he traced it back, every time to the 11-year-old boy standing on a street corner who had watched a stranger settle, in under a second, what 6 years of the county's own paperwork had never managed to touch. What the Nameless Gunman carries with him across the rest of that territory, whatever it is that pulls him toward a street like the one in Redwater Bend, and then pulls him just as surely away from it before the story is finished playing out, he put a dying woman's furniture back inside her house and rode on without waiting to learn whether she kept the shop, or lost it, or lived long enough to see her daughter running it in her place. By the time any of that was decided, he was already somewhere else entirely. He was, by every account anyone ever gave of him, always already somewhere else. Do you think he ever wondered, riding north out of that valley, what he'd left standing behind him? Or was he already looking down the next stretch of road, already moving toward whatever waited for him past the hills? Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if a story like Adeline Voss's is the kind that finds you at the right moment, late at night in a quiet room, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and ring the bell, because the territory is wide, the towns keep coming, and somewhere out past the last fence line, a man on a tired bay horse is already riding toward the next one.